Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly on creaking parquet floors into the silken, perfumed haze of 17th century France. The candles are already lit, the bed curtains are drawn, and outside the marble corridors of Versailles, someone is whispering something scandalous about a duke, a duck, and three too many glasses of fortified wine. You're here now, wrapped in your favorite blanket, safe from the powdered chaos, the chamber pots, and the ever-present possibility of your tutor accusing you of harboring a lust demon in your spleen. Yes, sex education in Louis XIV's France was less about biology and more about theology, fear, and furniture placement. Imagine trying to learn the birds and the bees while being warned that even a curious glance might attract an invisible succubus who smelled faintly of burnt cinnamon and poor decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. That's always my favorite part. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through Versailles, your stockings itch, your wig is starting to wilt, and someone just spilled wine on your cravat again. But you're not here for a soiree. You're here because someone decided that this was the week you'd receive your formal education in the acts of nature, which in 17th century France meant sex education so indirect and bizarre it could be considered interpretive dance with garlic cloves. The royal tutors, the Jesuits mostly, aren't too keen on naming anything anatomical. You're told that your body is a vessel, and your urges, mischievous whispers of the devil's servants. That's not metaphor. That's Tuesday's lesson. You're 12, maybe 13. You've just been handed a little book titled De l'âme et du corps, on the soul and the body, and instructed to read the chapter about impure temptations. It mostly consists of warnings about nighttime emissions, a section on how to pray away unwanted dreams, and a helpful diagram showing a man's soul being yanked by a tail-wielding imp toward a flaming ditch of regret. No mention of what that odd thing between your legs is called, but plenty of advice on how not to think about it, ever. Meanwhile, across the chateau, a noblewoman in training is being lectured by a very serious nun about the importance of closing one's eyes and letting duty take its course. Her textbook is a series of faded engravings depicting Adam and Eve looking vaguely embarrassed. She's told that pleasure is a reward in the afterlife, not a perk of the wedding night. And yet, despite all the repression, French society is absolutely buzzing with lust. Courtiers flirt behind fans. Love letters are passed via melon baskets. And if you stand in the right corridor after dinner, you'll hear more giggles and moans than Latin recitations. Let's not forget our first sex story of the night, from Sex with Kings. One of Louis XIV's mistresses, Louise de la Vallière, once confessed that she thought her affections were sinful, until the king reassured her that their love was ordained by divine right. What a convenient theology. And she, bless her, believed him. Their nightly rendezvous became legend. But when she later retired to a convent out of guilt, the court barely noticed. They were already gossiping about the next mistress and her unusually detailed knowledge of ancient Greek love positions. Historians still argue whether this kind of royal promiscuity helped liberalize French views on sex or merely distracted from the deeply moralizing messages pushed onto the lower classes. Either way, Versailles was a paradox, publicly pious, privately pillow-fluffed. Speaking of paradoxes, here comes your first fringe tidbit. In some rural French regions, it was believed that young boys could prevent impure dreams by sleeping with a small silver bell under their pillow. The bell would apparently scare off lustful demons, or at the very least, give the mattress a satisfying jingle every time you rolled over. Imagine explaining that to your sleepover guests. You wander further through the palace, where tapestries depict scenes from the Old Testament, Samson, Delilah, and a suspicious amount of naked ankles. Everything in this world seems to whisper about desire, but only in code. Courtiers talk about hunting and feasting and milking goats when they mean entirely other things. And if you thought modern slang was strange, try decoding phrases like plucking the cherry in the moonlight or kneading the sacred dough. Both were once recorded euphemisms in romantic poetry, and neither had anything to do with baking. But even amid all this coded chaos, your formal education continues. You're reminded again to guard your essence, to flee from lascivious shadows, and most importantly, to avoid spicy foods. Yes, the French medical consensus of the time firmly believed that garlic, onions, and mustard could awaken the flesh, which is ironic considering the average diet of a courtier included exactly those things, daily. And so, sex education in 17th century France was a strange dance, half religion, half rumor, and one-third Renaissance fan fiction. A society that made flirting an art form while pretending that sex was simply the unfortunate result of poor spiritual posture. You finally collapse on a fainting couch, your brain full of allegory and your body full of unspoken questions. Outside, the moon rises. Somewhere, a monk finishes transcribing yet another prayer against lust. And in the kitchen, someone is chopping garlic, perhaps for supper, or perhaps for a lesson in chastity. You're up before dawn today, not because you're a morning person, but because you've just learned that today's lesson involves garlic, and not the tasty kind that simmers in a skillet with butter. No, this garlic is sacred, scandalous, and apparently a critical tool in France's 17th century approach to sex education. You're marched, not too briskly down the gravel path, to the herbalist's shed. A nun with eyebrows arched like accusatory quills waits there with a bundle of herbs in one hand and a clove of garlic in the other. She doesn't blink as she explains. A virtuous girl's thighs will not absorb garlic. A fallen one, she will smell of soup for days. And just like that, welcome to the infamous garlic test, one of the many off-the-books rituals passed down by women who were half healers, half holy enforcers. The logic went something like this. If garlic rubbed on a girl's inner thigh gave off no scent later on, she was pure. If she reeked of bouillabaisse by lunchtime, well, she had some confessing to do. Historians still argue whether this test was ever truly widespread, or more an urban legend passed between suspicious mothers and creatively vengeful aunties. But we have enough whispered letters and parish logs referencing the odeur d'Isle to know that the myth had serious staying power. Whether it worked? That's beside the point. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. Your mind drifts. Garlic. Why garlic? Why not rosemary or roses? One theory suggests that garlic, being sharp and potent, was believed to reveal impurities by sheer olfactory aggression. Another says it came from older folk traditions, where garlic was used to ward off evil, vampires, demons, and in this case, teenage boys. Which brings us to our second tale of the night, tucked away in the erotic spirit through history. There's the story of a French baron who tried to seduce a novice nun with garlic-scented pastries. He claimed the herbs were an aphrodisiac, blessed by St. Augustine. She believed him for about 3 bites, then vomited into her wimple and ran screaming into the chapel. The baron was excommunicated. The pastries, however, became quite popular in the kitchens. You look around the herbalist's hut again. Bundles of lavender dangle beside holy water. There's a diagram of a chaste woman's pulse rate, whatever that means, pinned beside a drawing of a goat and a large question mark. Science, it seems, has taken a backseat to symbolism. And just when you think it can't get stranger, you're handed a scroll listing foods to avoid if one values one's innocence. Garlic, obviously, onions, figs, wine, shellfish, and, bizarrely, melons. Apparently, melons were believed to over-moisten the body's humors, leading to lewd dreams. Scholars still debate whether that was based on ancient Greek medical theories or just the fear of slippery fruit. The nun continues. She talks about how garlic could not only reveal sin, but repel temptation. Some girls, she said with a sniff, wore garlic braided into their corsets. A boy who got too close would get a noseful and a hem rethink his intentions. Others crushed cloves into sachets and tucked them beneath pillows, hoping to chase away seductive dreams and any impish nighttime visitors. Oh, did I mention the demons? Yes, you're also warned that impure thoughts are like breadcrumbs for demonic activity. Garlic, again, comes to the rescue. Rubbed behind the ears or between the toes, it was thought to block demonic entry points. I wish I were kidding. You consider that for a moment. A world where your toes are a sin entry portal. Suddenly, those scratchy stockings don't feel so unnecessary. From the history of sexuality comes a passage noting how such bodily rituals were part of a broader strategy to internalize control. You weren't just told to act pure, you had to feel pure, smell pure, and even dream pure. Garlic became the badge of that bodily policing. It was inexpensive, strong, and impossible to ignore, just like the church's expectations. You sit back on a low wooden bench, listening as the nun recounts how a bishop once required every unmarried girl in his diocese to wear garlic necklaces during Lent. The scent, he claimed, was a gift to God and a warning to men. Unsurprisingly, that Lent saw a dramatic increase in boys fainting in choir. Still, the garlic served more than one purpose. A fringe detail tucked away in a forgotten Jesuit manual mentions that garlic was also used to mask the smell of certain ailments. A girl who feared being outed for venereal disease might hide behind the stench of repentance or lunch. Hard to say. And here you are now, finally allowed to return to your chambers. You feel strange, a bit like a roast, but also strangely empowered. Garlic, it turns out, isn't just for scaring off vampires. It's a moral compass, a truth teller, a seduction deterrent, a social deodorant with bite. As you sink into your feather-stuffed mattress, the garlic sachet now tucked beneath your pillow, you think about how different this all is from what you wanted sex ed to be. Maybe a diagram, maybe a whispered story behind the stables. Instead, you get root vegetables and metaphors, and the nagging suspicion that you'll dream about someone slicing onions behind your knees. The candle flickers once, then steadies. In the darkness, you hear a whisper, probably the wind, maybe a ghost, or possibly someone's midnight snack. Garlic, you now know, has more uses than anyone ever dared explain, and your thighs still smell like soup. The next morning, you're groggy. The pillow still smells faintly of last night's garlic sachet, equal parts dinner and doom. You stretch, yawn, and knock over a copy of your devotional workbook, which you now know is really just a collection of terrifying metaphors loosely tied together by paranoia and penmanship. But today's lesson is even stranger. You're escorted to a classroom. Well, it's more of a drawing room with heavy drapes and an alarming number of statues. Most of them are missing arms or toes, but all of them appear to be strategically avoiding eye contact. The tutor is an older priest who smells like sandalwood and wet parchment. He opens the lesson with, "Children, today we discuss the devil's favorite topic, the sins of the flesh." And just like that, you're neck deep in demonology. But not the exciting fire and brimstone kind. No, this is intimate demonology, an area of education that explains bodily desire as an uninvited house guest sent straight from hell. Today, you learn about incubi and succubi. Incubi are male demons who seduce women at night, usually disguised as attractive men, or in one particularly dramatic case, as a well-dressed goose. Succubi do the opposite, targeting men in their dreams, stealing their essence for infernal purposes. You are advised to sleep on your back, never your stomach, to avoid such encounters. Because, of course, that's how they slip in. According to the history of sexuality, these teachings weren't simply folklore, they were backed by institutional fear. Clergy believed that lust, especially in the dark and unmonitored spaces of the mind, could invite real spiritual corruption. And so young men were instructed to recite a short prayer before bed, followed by the Lord's Prayer, and finally a few firm slaps to their own cheeks to rouse the spirit. You try not to laugh. Your tutor doesn't. The church even had advice for what to do if you suspected a demon had visited during the night. Step 1, light a candle. Step 2, sprinkle salt in the corners of your bed. Step 3, confess immediately to your priest and try to remember any distinguishing features. Sometimes they come with mismatched feet, says your tutor. Other times, no face at all. Quirky tidbit for today. One medieval French bishop insisted that all confessional booths be equipped with a small wooden carving of a succubus, just so penitents could point to where it touched them. The carving was removed after several boys refused to leave the booth, claiming they needed more visual aid. Meanwhile, your fellow student, Jacques, poor Jacques, is trembling in the corner. His cousin once claimed to have been visited in a dream by a black-eyed woman who told him secrets about cheese and love. Now Jacques thinks every itch is a portal. He's requested to sleep with a crucifix in each sock. The fear is real. The education? Less so. Instead of learning about consent, anatomy, or communication, you're drilled on the signs of spiritual invasion. A persistent erection? Demonic. A curious dream, likely influenced by an unseen imp hiding in your bedpost. Even a desire to bathe alone is considered a red flag for temptation. And let's not forget the candles. Yes, candles were part of the defense. Beeswax candles, in particular, were believed to emit a holy scent that repelled demons. You were told to place them at the four corners of your chamber and light them in sequence while reciting Psalm 51. Do it wrong, and the demons might get angry, or worse, curious. Now, here's your sex story of the night. From Sex with Kings, we meet Queen Marie Therese, Louis XIV's long-suffering wife. While Louis was gallivanting through a rotating list of mistresses, Marie was instructed by her spiritual advisor to wear a blessed medallion at all times, including in bed. It was said to protect her from unwanted nocturnal disturbances. Whether those disturbances were demonic or marital, historians still debate. But what we do know, the queen insisted on keeping the candle lit even while asleep. You glance at your own candle. It's shaped like a swan and smells vaguely of regret. Still, you light it, just in case. As the priest drones on about how demons can also inhabit livestock, seriously, your attention drifts to the open window. Outside, a maid is humming, oblivious to the infernal fear lecture echoing indoors. The wind is warm. Summer is arriving. Somewhere, someone is falling in love in a garden. And here you are, memorizing which direction to sneeze if you feel unholy urges. That's right. There's even a sacred sneeze technique in case of temptation. You're told to look left, always left, and sneeze into your elbow while reciting a verse. Why the left? Because the devil favors the right, which makes almost no sense. But it is dramatic. Historians still argue whether this obsession with demons was a carryover from earlier medieval Puritanism or whether it was a reaction to the scandalous liberalism of the French court. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. For every pious priest inventing sneeze rituals, there was a duke seducing 3 widows before lunch. And so you try your best to follow the rules. You light your candles, you sleep on your back, you rub garlic on your temples if your dreams get spicy, you pray, you sneeze left. And still, every now and then, a shadow moves in the corner of your vision, and you wonder, is that lust or just a moth? The lesson ends with a reminder. Temptation begins in the mind, but ends in the flesh. You're told to keep your thoughts pure, your sheets cold, and your soul guarded. You nod politely, then tiptoe back to your room, candle in hand, mentally cataloging all the reasons not to dream about geese tonight. Tonight, you're summoned not to a lesson with stiff-backed tutors or incense-choked chapels, but something called the Vigil of Margot. The name alone sounds like a play, or maybe a dessert. But as you shuffle behind the rest of the students, half asleep, half curious, you're told it's a morality tale, one of the older ones. The kind they only tell under certain stars and when the cows start acting up. You're seated on rough-woven cushions inside a chilly hall, lit by oil lamps and smelling vaguely of wet straw. At the front stands an old abbess with a scroll in one hand and a bundle of garlic cloves in the other, and she begins in the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who's told this story 100 times, each time slightly different. The girl's name, she says, was Margot of Rouen, 16, a milkmaid, red cheeks, sang to her cows, not that unusual. But Margot had a peculiar habit. She liked to dance. Not in ballrooms, but alone in the fields, often barefoot, often near rings of mushrooms, which the locals whispered were fairy circles, though the church preferred the term signs of sensual disturbance. One warm evening in midsummer, Margot was seen dancing at dusk, twirling slowly in a circle of mushrooms, skirt swaying, hair loose. No music, just her hum. And above her a comet with a long red tail streaked the sky. This, the abbess says, is where the trouble begins. Margot claimed later that the comet had whispered her name, that it spoke in rhymes promising warmth and secrets. And then she saw him, a man with golden hair, smiling at the edge of the tree line. She said he wore no shoes, smelled faintly of mint, and had too many teeth. The man vanished with the comet. Margot, disoriented, wandered into the hayloft. When the farmer found her the next morning, her dress was torn at the hem, her feet were muddy, and, most troubling of all, the cows had all been milked perfectly at the exact same time. Unnatural, suspicious, clearly evidence of something infernal. She was taken to the priest, who consulted his celestial indicators of carnal behavior. An actual chart drawn in red ink and full of astrological symbols. Venus was in retrograde, Jupiter had risen crooked, and Mars was doing something no one quite understood. The verdict? Margot had been touched not by man, but by planetary temptation, and so began her trial. Not in court, but in the chapel. A ritual of cleansing was held, involving lavender smoke, holy water, and a goat skull that had supposedly belonged to St. Hubert's very own beast. Margot, dazed and compliant, was told to sleep only on straw, avoid mirrors, and remain silent during full moons. She agreed. She stopped dancing, and she never sang to her cows again. You shift uncomfortably as the abbess continues, because this tale, so strange, so dreamy, wasn't unique. In 17th century France, sexual education, especially for girls, often came through stories like this. Cautionary, supernatural, and brimming with cosmic metaphors. Science, rarely involved. But astrology, always. If your daughter blushed often, Mercury was blamed. If your son stared too long at the sky, Venus was pulling at his humors. Today you're told that looking at the moon for too long might invite dreamy lusts. Eating oysters on Fridays was considered dangerous, ruled by Neptune, the patron of moist appetites. And peaches, a fruit to avoid entirely during Lent, too soft, too round, too suggestive. It all sounds absurd, and yet it was taken seriously enough that noble families kept star charts pinned next to their devotional calendars. A mother might consult the moon phase before allowing her daughter to attend Vespers. If Mars was near, better to stay home and embroider. Stitching, after all, distracted the hands and the mind. Tonight's sex story from the erotic spirit through history involves a certain court astrologer named Pierre Delacour. Pierre was famous not for his predictions, but for his planetary intimacy calendar. He claimed that each day of the week carried specific erotic potential. Mondays were good for gentle discovery. Wednesdays, ideal for vigorous affection. Saturdays were reserved for contemplative caress. Pierre's guide swept the salons of Paris. Lovers scheduled rendezvous with celestial precision. One duchess insisted on reading her horoscope aloud before every kiss. Pierre became rich briefly, then was imprisoned for selling aphrodisiacs disguised as communion wafers. Back to Margot. Her silence became a symbol. Other girls were warned, don't be like Margot. Parents told stories of her dancing into the arms of Saturn's spawn. Farmers swore their sheep stopped mating after hearing her name. And though no one ever proved anything, her tale became a kind of folk sex ed, equal parts cautionary myth and moral compass. Your fringe fact for tonight? In some rural parishes, boys were made to wear lavender sachets tied to their ankles during their teenage years. To ground their desires, the priest said. But the real reason? Lavender's scent was believed to ward off succubi, and if a boy's sachet lost its smell too quickly, questions would be asked. You step outside after the story ends, the air thick with the scent of herbs and candle smoke. The moon is bright, too bright, a waxy crescent glinting like an eye above the chapel. You find yourself walking faster than usual, not because you believe, but because Margot's hum won't leave your head. It follows you, note for note, like something ancient and half-remembered. You crawl into bed, exhausted, and glance once at the stars before pulling the blanket over your eyes. You tell yourself the sky is just light, that the moon has no feelings, that comets don't whisper names, and yet, when you close your eyes, you dream of mushrooms. You awaken to a strange tapping sound, not footsteps, not rain, something softer, like fingertips against wood. You sit up in your feather mattress, blink against the dusty morning light, and realize it's coming from down the hall. The confessional room. Someone's already inside. You pull on your slippers, squishy, embroidered, and way too pointy, and follow the sound. It's Jock. Again. Poor, overly anxious Jock, who's been confessing twice a day ever since Sister Bernadette gave that talk about how desire is a gateway sin with 7 slippery steps. He's been stuck on step 3 for a week. You turn around before you're spotted, but it's too late. Father Etienne is waiting. He's tall, owl-eyed, and smells like ink and regret. You, he says, cheerfully grim, today you learn about confession and the body. And with that, welcome to the next strange layer of 17th century sex education. Confess first, then fumble. In theory, confession is about unburdening your soul. In practice, here in this little sliver of Bourbon, France, it's a deeply anatomical ritual filled with awkward silences, evasive metaphors, and the occasional Latin-based euphemism that makes even the statues blush. You're handed a parchment, le péché du corps, and asked to study the list. Lustful glances, lascivious thoughts, immodest dreams, all there. But so are things like fondness for tight boots and overconsumption of almond paste. Apparently, indulgence was a slippery slope, and if you did stumble, if, say, you had an indecent dream about a stable boy feeding you grapes, well, then you'd better describe it carefully. Confessors were trained to recognize patterns, to ask questions gently but precisely. There were even printed guides, actual handbooks meant to help them phrase the tough stuff. One particularly infamous clerical guide from 1668 included 76 sample questions just for immodest nocturnal activities. 76. That's dedication or obsession. In The History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault explores how this kind of structured interrogation turned confession into a form of control, one that shaped desire by making it public, dissected, and shame-riddled. Wanting was no longer private. It had to be named, categorized, and then prayed away. You remember a friend, Marie, a merchant's daughter, who once confessed that she had dreamed of running through a field without a corset. Just that. No touching. No man. Just wind. The priest made her repeat the dream, twice. Then suggested 3 Our Fathers, a cold bath, and no plums for a week. Historians still debate whether these priests truly believed they were protecting souls or simply projecting their own anxieties onto the congregation. But what's clear is this: the more precise the sin, the deeper the hold the church had on your body. Today's sex story? It's a whispery one, half rumor, half memory. From Sex with Kings, we hear of Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's famously bold mistress. She too confessed, but not in a chapel. No, she had a private spiritual advisor who conducted rituals involving salt circles, dove's feathers, and anointing oils rumored to be mixed with crushed emeralds. She wanted forgiveness, but not too much. She once said, "A clean conscience is lovely, but it should never smell like soap." Elegant, confusing, and entirely on brand. You can't help but compare that to your current experience, where even the scent of soap, especially lavender or almond, is suspect. Some clerics taught that bathing could awaken the flesh. Others believed that uncleanliness was protection. One bishop famously advised, "A little stink keeps the devil away." No wonder the palace hallways always reek of old wool and unresolved longing. Now for your fringe fact. In some parts of rural France, confession booths came with a small wheel of questions. If the confessor was too shy, they could simply spin the wheel, and the priest would ask the question it landed on. A sort of sanctified game of sins. Number 12. Have you impurely gazed at a lute player this week? Spin again. You shuffle back to your room with 3 prayers to recite, 1 abstinence chart to fill out, and a sachet of dried rosemary to cool the spirit. You try to focus. You really do. But now you're haunted by the idea that almond paste might be morally compromising, which is tragic because the kitchen's almond tarts are phenomenal. Later that afternoon, you sit under the chapel's fig tree, flipping through a devotional pamphlet. It's a reprint of a Jesuit tract full of firm warnings. Avoid mirrors, tight garments, idle melodies, and warm bread. Warm bread? You blink. Surely that's a misprint. But no. Warm bread awakens the stomach and the senses. You're starting to suspect that in 17th century France, anything vaguely pleasant was considered suspect. And so you learn. Sex education wasn't about knowledge. It was about naming guilt before the sin happened. It was the art of training the body through fear, repetition, and shame. And sometimes it was about spinning a wooden wheel and hoping you didn't land on question 17. That night, as you light your beeswax candle and sniff your rosemary sachet, you find yourself whispering confessions into the mattress. Not because you're sinful, but because the habit has sunk in, because the fear of warm bread and almond paste has burrowed under your skin, and because, maybe, just maybe, you also dreamed of running corset-free in a field. You wake to scratching at your door. Not the anxious scratching of a desperate lover. No, it's the impatient tapping of a novice nun named Celeste, who always seems to have the energy of someone raised exclusively on vinegar and suspicion. "Up," she whispers, as if you were doing something improper by sleeping. The bishop's guidebook has arrived. You groan. This can't be good. Downstairs, the hall is unusually quiet. The other students, bundled in cloaks and yawns, are gathered around a large wooden crate. One of the priests, Father Leclerc, is already unpacking its contents with theatrical flair, lifting each piece of parchment as though unwrapping a relic, which, in a sense, he is. This, he tells you, is the Manual of Penitential Procedures for the Flesh and its Fallings. It's a bishop-approved catalog of sins, painstakingly organized, color-coded, and broken down by body part. And this morning, you're going to learn how to use it. You sit cross-legged on the cold tile floor, hands folded, trying not to smirk, because this guidebook, for all its solemnity, is bizarre. Each entry lists an act, a method, and a recovery protocol. The tone is part medical journal, part horror novel, part very awkward poetry. For example, under left thigh unintentional grazing, the sin is labeled as venial but watchful. Suggested penance, 3 Our Fathers and the reading of Psalm 31 while facing east. Next entry, neck kissed in vain. That one's gravely provocative. Penance, fasting for 1 day, no singing and avoiding figs. You blink. Did that say figs again? Yes, the bishop had it out for figs. This kind of microclassification wasn't just a curiosity, it was theology as surveillance. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault describes how these manuals were part of a larger movement toward bodily discipline. The church wasn't content with general morals anymore. It wanted charts, specifics, footnotes. If temptation was a disease, these guidebooks were its epidemiology. And then comes your assignment. You're given a scenario, hypothetical of course. A girl has accidentally brushed hands with a boy during morning prayer. He smiled, she blushed. There was eye contact. What must she do? You flip through the pages. Under eye contact sustained, you find 2 Hail Marys, a cold compress, and refrain from gazing upon tapestries for 3 days. Tapestries, apparently, are full of suggestive posture, especially the unicorn ones. Next case, a kiss on the cheek exchanged between cousins during a feast. That's under familial contact, festive circumstance. It's suspicious but redeemable. Suggested penance, reciting the genealogy of Mary Magdalene from memory while holding a turnip. A turnip. You start to wonder whether this book was written sincerely or by someone with a flair for culinary revenge. Here's your fringe tidbit. One surviving copy of a similar 17th century French manual contains marginal doodles, tiny ink drawings of demons being swatted with baguettes. Scholars aren't sure whether they were made by a bored novice or a particularly cheeky abbot, but either way, it adds charm to a deeply uncharming text. Your assigned partner today is a boy named Luck. He's usually quiet, always smells like nutmeg, and once admitted that he's afraid of the Virgin Mary's eyes and stained glass windows. You're told to practice using the guidebook together, acting out penitent scenarios. Luke chooses to reenact the infamous apple-sharing sin from a chapter called Edibles with Double Meaning. You sit in the garden, pass an apple back and forth, and dramatically look guilty. The instructor nods approvingly. You feel like you're starring in the world's most boring romance novel. Today's featured story comes from Sex with Kings, and it involves Queen Christina of Sweden, not a French monarch, but a visiting curiosity in the 1650s. Christina famously cross-dressed, refused to marry, and once asked the French court's confessors whether women could sin in the mind only. They were flustered. She was not. She later dismissed half her staff for being too predictable and declared figs a threat to philosophical clarity. That fig hatred again. Historians still argue whether these guidebooks were ever truly followed to the letter or simply used as performative deterrents. Some believe they served as moral theater, props for guilt, not solutions. Others think they were deadly serious. One bishop reportedly excommunicated a noblewoman for confusing occasional thigh exposure with intentional lower limb display. A fine but apparently eternal distinction. You close the book. Your brain aches from sin taxonomy. Your knees ache from sitting too long. And your soul, frankly, it just wants a nap and maybe some unsupervised plum jam. Later that night, you dream of turnips, giant ones, talking ones. One of them wears a bishop's mitre and demands you recite Psalm 31 backwards. You wake up panicked, then embarrassed, then hungry. By morning, the guidebook has been locked away, back into its crate, sealed with red wax and a warning sticker. Well, not a sticker, more of a parchment ribbon that says Cave Corpus. Beware the body. But even sealed, its logic lingers. You now find yourself assessing things differently. Every brush, every look, every sensation comes with a question. Where would this fall in the bishop's guidebook? It's exhausting, which might have been the point all along. The church didn't want you to understand your body. It wanted you to monitor it like a faulty gate, to document the rust, to fear the creak. And so you do, because now you know the difference between lingering sighs and idle exhalations, between passive wrist showing and flirtatious sleeve positioning. You'll never look at a fig the same way again. You're beginning to notice a pattern. Every time you think you've reached the peak of 17th century absurdity, someone in a starched collar announces a new instructional session with all the gravity of a military decree. Today's summons arrives during breakfast. Half a boiled egg and a wedge of stale bread, delivered with a scroll sealed in wax and a sprig of lavender ominously tucked underneath. The title? Madam's Marital Lessons and Lavender Oil. You're escorted not to the chapel, not to the hall, but to a small salon off the east wing where 3 chairs face an embroidered screen. There are cushions, incense, a bowl of candied almonds, so clearly this is serious. A woman waits behind the screen, barely visible through the silk gauze. You recognize her accent, southern, elegant, heavy with honey and warning. She begins without greeting. Before you wed, you must learn what to endure. You sit straighter. This, apparently, is what passes for elite sex education for young noblewomen. Madam, the veiled instructor behind the screen, is a widow 3 times over, once to a merchant, once to a count, and once, mysteriously, to a man who fell down the stairs during harvest. She doesn't elaborate. What she does share, however, is startlingly intimate. Men, she says, are like soup. They improve with seasoning, but if left too long unattended, they spoil. There's a pause as someone takes notes. Her advice, filtered through embroidery and whisper, includes the following gems. Always dab lavender oil on your wrists before lying beside your husband. It softens the blow of disappointment. Speak little during coupling unless asked, but if asked, answer with compliments about his posture. If pain arises, blame the stars or a recent chill. Never imply dissatisfaction. You nod slowly, unsure whether this is a philosophy or a hostage negotiation. She continues. On your wedding night, you must undress without meeting his gaze. Let the maid blow out the candles. If he insists on light, Madame intones, make sure the shadows fall kindly. She suggests a trick involving a lace fan, a candle, and a strategically placed bowl of wine. Historians still debate whether these salons were genuine attempts at empowerment or merely an elegant form of emotional preparation. Some argue that noble women wielded subtle power in the bedroom, choosing how to respond, when to feign interest, and which herbs to stir into their husband's wine. Others insist these lessons were pure survival training, a polite coat of varnish on a system built around silence and sacrifice. Tonight's sex story comes from Sex with Kings, of course. Madame de Maintenon, who eventually became Louis XIV's morganatic wife, was famous for instructing other women on how to disarm the king with chastity. She reportedly refused his advances multiple times, while wearing lace gloves and quoting St. Augustine. Her resistance only made him more obsessed. She is said to have remarked, "Virtue, when fashionable, is the sharpest seduction." Not exactly Kama Sutra material, but effective. You learn that lavender wasn't just for scent, it was thought to calm nerves, to prevent hysteria, and, crucially, to mask the smell of unwashed husbands. Women were instructed to soak their linens in lavender water before the act, and sometimes to tuck sprigs under the mattress to ensure purity of spirit. You imagine a poor maid choking on herbs as she stuffs bouquets beneath featherbeds. Your fringe detail for the evening? A few women, desperate for more enthusiastic responses from their spouses, would secretly wear sachets of garlic and cinnamon around their thighs. One duchess, writing anonymously, swore it summoned the beast in him for better or worse. She did not elaborate on the worse. Back in the salon, Madame shares a few last tips. Never yawn during courtship. Never undress fully unless asked. And always cry softly the first time. It flatters the male ego. You exchange looks at the girl beside you. She mouths, "Always cry?" You both suppress laughter, but Madame hears the shift in breath and pauses. Then slowly she leans forward until her silhouette nearly kisses the gauze. "Ladies," she says, "if you must weep, do it beautifully, with purpose." That night, You return to your chamber with a velvet pouch of lavender oil, a folded sheet of handwritten instructions, and the strangest cocktail of dread and fascination. You try dabbing the oil on your wrists. It smells like gardens and ghosts. As you lie down, you try to imagine being one of those noble brides, fumbling in darkness, praying your new husband doesn't trip over the bowl of wine, pretending not to notice the lace fan catching fire in the corner. You wonder, did they really find comfort in these rituals? Or did they just memorize them like survival spells, passed from woman to woman in the hush between candle snuffs? Historians still argue whether Madame's lessons empowered women to navigate impossible choices, or simply taught them how to disappear gracefully behind lavender and lace. Either way, her voice echoes in your ears as sleep draws near. Endure prettily, sin gently, and always control the lighting. You wake up to chaos, not the exciting kind, like a ballroom scandal or a duel fought with poetry. No, this is comet-related chaos. Apparently, sometime before dawn, a bright red-tailed comet was spotted streaking across the sky above the river. And if there's one thing you've learned by now, it's that in 17th century France, the appearance of any celestial body brighter than a candle throws the entire social and moral order into full dramatic collapse. You haven't even finished tying your stays when someone bangs on your door shouting, "Cover your head, the heavens are watching!" You open the door a crack to find a novice nun sprinting past holding a basket of garlic and what appears to be a pair of woolen bloomers marked with protective crosses. You blink. You sigh. You put on your shoes. Down in the hall, the atmosphere is thick with unease and the smell of overused incense. Father Jerome stands beside a hastily arranged lectern, flanked by two terrified-looking kitchen boys clutching lavender bundles. He holds up a fresh pamphlet printed only hours ago, no doubt someone worked through the night, titled "When Comets Stir Carnal Curiosity, a Caution for Youth." He clears his throat. "My children, temptation travels by starlight." And so begins another lesson. Today, the church has decided to educate you on the dangerous astrological influences of heavenly phenomena, specifically comets and their alleged tendency to inspire what the pamphlet calls illicit stirrings of the flesh. You glance around. A few students are trying not to laugh. One girl pretends to faint from fear of Venus. You're given a case study, for contemplation, not entertainment, Father Jerome warns, about a young farm girl named Annette, a daughter of a cheese herder from the outskirts of Blois. Annette was, by all accounts, a sweet girl, quiet, devout, fond of quince jam. But one summer evening, a fiery comet appeared above the valley. That night, Annette was found in the hayloft, beside the apothecary's son, and strangely, an empty pie tin. The investigation revealed she had accepted a quince tart from the young man. She claimed the tart warmed her heart, that the stars whispered approval, and that the cow standing nearby looked at her with knowing eyes. She also reportedly said the comet felt like it was winking. Now, this being 17th century France, the issue was not her honesty, but her timing. She was promptly declared cosmically influenced, which is not as fun as it sounds. The apothecary's son was relocated to a monastery. Annette was banned from eating stone fruits for a year. And the cow? Legend says it was quietly sold to an Italian astrologer. Historians still argue whether Annette was truly a victim of superstition or simply used the comet as an excuse for an entirely earthly desire. What's interesting is that cases like hers weren't rare. Records from this time are littered with similar stories, young people blaming eclipses, meteor showers, or oddly bright moons for sudden romantic lapses. In a society where admitting your own desire was dangerous, blaming the stars was safer. Tonight's sex story, courtesy of the erotic spirit through history, echoes this theme. A noblewoman from Provence once claimed she was overwhelmed with unholy affection after witnessing a particularly vivid lightning storm. She said it shattered the chastity of her thoughts. Her mother, alarmed, summoned a doctor who prescribed a strict diet of celery broth, weekly leeching, and daily readings of the Psalms. The noblewoman, undeterred, later eloped with a shepherd and composed sonnets about thunder. You think of Annette, of the apothecary's son, of the poor, overanalyzed cow. Then Father Jerome presents you with today's protective tools. A braided moon belt made of linen, meant to be tied 7 times around the waist, and infused with lavender, rosemary, and a single clove of garlic. Girls are told to wear it until the comet disappears from the sky. Boys are told to keep their gazes firmly downward and not to think of quince in any context. The ceinture de lune, as it's called, was a real folk tradition in some parts of rural France. Meant to bind the desires provoked by celestial unrest, it was more psychological than magical. But in a time when science, superstition, and social fear danced together like three drunk courtiers at a feast, it made perfect sense. Your fringe tidbit of the evening? In a small village near Bordeaux, there was once a ritual where young women would sing to the moon during a comet sighting, hoping to release their heat to the stars. They'd gather near wells and hum old chants. The church banned the practice, calling it lunar lasciviousness, but it lingered in secret, whispered, half-sung, woven into lullabies. Back in the hall, the tension is starting to dissolve. Someone sneezes. A few girls giggle. Father Jerome, sensing he's losing the crowd, doubles down with a dramatic reading of Psalm 32, followed by an anecdote about a farmer who swore his goats behaved too amorously during the last major eclipse. You escape to the garden as the lecture ends, your moon belt slightly itchy under your gown, the lavender making your skin feel oddly philosophical. You stare at the comet, barely visible now against the fading dusk. It's smaller than you imagined, just a streak of light. You wonder what it would feel like to actually believe the stars control you, to think desire isn't something messy and human, but a gift or a curse from the sky. Would it make things easier, more romantic, or just more complicated? You lie on the grass and try to picture Annette, her soft-spoken confession, her quince tart, her quiet rebellion, told in crumbs and glances and cosmic excuses. She didn't shout, she didn't run, she just leaned into the moment and let the comet take the blame. Maybe it's not the worst idea. You close your eyes. The grass is cool beneath your palms. The comet hovers above, silent and forgiving. You hum a tune from the band Moonwell songs and let the stars carry your thoughts. Somewhere gentle, somewhere bright, somewhere far from figless kitchens and lavender belts. You wake to diagrams. Not the sort you'd hope for, clear, labeled, informative, but strange Baroque renderings laid out on the table in the scriptorium like something between a treasure map and a fever dream. One parchment features what appears to be a man, or maybe a satyr, labeled Homo incertus, with arrows pointing to his ankles and a small cherub blowing on his left earlobe. Another shows a uterus floating freely around the torso like a hot air balloon. This, apparently, is Anatomy Day. Father Benoit, the priest with hands permanently stained with ink and wine, introduces the lesson with something he calls medieval reproductive logic. You sit cross-legged on the cold stone floor, surrounded by giggling girls and two boys, trying very hard not to make eye contact with any illustration that resembles a breast. The first diagram he holds up is entitled The Wandering Womb, which he assures you is not a metaphor. The womb, he explains solemnly, is like a squirrel. It runs if left unstimulated. You snort and get elbowed. But he's serious, dead serious. According to centuries of prevailing medical thought, Galenic, Aristotelian, and deeply confused, the female uterus could detach and drift up the body, suffocating the heart, confusing the brain, or in one especially imaginative case, causing hiccups and melancholy. The cure? Smells. Strong odors drive it downward, sweet ones invite it up. Hence the lavender and garlic obsession. You're handed your own diagram to study. It's smudged, slightly burnt at the corners, and confusing. The male body is depicted with gears, the female with clouds. Both diagrams include Latin phrases no one can translate, and several mystery organs that look suspiciously like squashed pears. Today's fringe fact: in one preserved French manuscript, male reproductive anatomy was described as a divine puzzle box, while the female equivalent was referred to as an interior garden whose gates must remain sealed, lest the lilies wilt. No one agrees what any of that means, but it sure sounds poetic. Next, you're asked to role-play a reproductive consultation. One student pretends to faint from wandering womb. Another student, playing the physician, waves burning rosemary over her feet while holding a sketch of a duck. Father Benoit nods approvingly. You start to realize something. These diagrams weren't meant to explain. They were meant to mystify, control, confuse. If no one truly understands how the body works, Then everyone relies on the church to interpret its quirks. One girl's missed period becomes divine punishment, another's flushed cheeks a sign of succubus interference, and the boys, well, they're told even less. There's a section on male pleasure that simply reads, like fire, quick to rise, dangerous to fuel, best extinguished in prayer. A few pages later, a note in the margin says, masturbation may cause blindness, forgetfulness, or unwanted musical talent. You look at Jack. He's humming again. Your sex story today comes from Sex with Kings, of course. A French nobleman, rumored to be the illegitimate son of Henri IV, once requested an anatomical sketch before his wedding night. He wanted to be prepared. What he received was a drawing of two doves facing each other, flanked by tulips and a Latin phrase that loosely translated to, approach the garden with song. He was reportedly so confused he attempted to serenade his bride's feet. Historians still argue whether these strange diagrams were the result of limited medical knowledge or deliberate obfuscation. Likely both. There were good physicians, of course, midwives, herbalists, scholars who tried to understand, but their voices were often drowned by clergy wielding moral authority and preposterous metaphors. You try sketching your own diagram as an act of rebellion. It features a heart, a hand, and a loaf of bread. You label the bread emotional digestion. No one stops you. Later that day, you overhear a group of older students debating whether certain herbs can shift the womb's direction. One insists that mint encourages upward floating. Another swears by vinegar compresses on the soles of the feet. Meanwhile, a boy across the courtyard is trying to translate a footnote that might or might not say lemon juice equals chastity. You retreat to the chapel library, where someone has left open a book called Tabulae Corporis Humani, the sacred charts of flesh. The illustrations are exquisite. Gold leaf highlights the bones. Tiny cherubs point toward the navel. But there's a catch. The genitals are missing, cleanly erased. In their place, vines. In one copy, grapes. In another, just the word mysteria. You close the book. So much time spent mapping the soul, the breath, the ideal shape of a modest elbow. Yet the most basic functions of the body remain hidden, veiled, abstracted behind euphemism and fear. It's no wonder you're confused. You were trained to be. As you lie in bed that night, diagram tucked under your pillow, you feel oddly adrift. What does it mean to inhabit a body that others try to draw but not explain? To be told that your own skin contains gardens, puzzles, and errant organs that roam like ghosts? You close your eyes. Somewhere in your mind, the uterus floats past a cloud, waves to a liver, and takes a left at the spleen. You imagine your breath as a squirrel, your heart as a harp, your desire as a dove that forgot its way home. And sleep, thankfully, makes no diagrams. Tonight's lesson takes place not in a hall, not in a chapel, but in what used to be the apothecary's basement. You descend the creaky wooden stairs with a group of half-curious, half-skeptical classmates and are immediately greeted by the smell of sulfur, goat tallow, and something that might once have been cabbage. There's a small lectern at the far end of the room, and beside it, a tall, narrow man named Brother Alphonse, who looks like he hasn't blinked since Pentecost. He clears his throat and opens with a sentence you'll remember forever. Ladies, gentlemen, today we address wombs that wander and the devil's fondness for unwashed goats. And thus begins your first lecture on female spiritual disorders. The theory goes something like this. When a woman's womb is not properly anchored through childbirth, prayer, or occasionally leech therapy, it becomes mobile. This isn't metaphorical. According to dozens of scholars from antiquity to your present day, the uterus could drift around the body like an indecisive balloon. And worse still, if it wandered far enough, it might attract attention from spirits, particularly the lustful kind. Hence the association between wombs, smells, and demonic interruption. You are shown a chart. On it, a crude drawing of a torso with arrows leading from the pelvis to the lungs, the brain, and somewhat confusingly, the left kneecap. Each arrow is labeled with symptoms: hysterical laughter, melancholy visions, irrepressible weeping, and the urge to compose rhymed poetry. You shift uneasily. You wrote a sonnet last week. Then comes the solution section: binding herbs, lavender, mugwort, garlic, burned rosemary, crushed mustard seed. Women were instructed to inhale these sharply if they felt their wombs ascending. If that failed, they were advised to place a garlic-stuffed sachet behind each ear and repeat Psalm 69 backward. Today's fringe detail? In the village of St. Combe, midwives once trained with tracking candles, a practice where the position of a floating flame was used to diagnose the womb's location. One case study claimed a candle turned clockwise in a bedroom, proving the uterus had lodged near the rib cage. Treatment involved 3 weeks of fennel soup and strict silence. Brother Alphonse turns the page of his parchment and begins to speak of goat smells. Apparently, demons favor animal odors, especially damp goat. Women accused of attracting succubi were sometimes instructed to hang near a goat pen for a full day to see whether the spirits followed. They usually do, Brother Alphonse says. You try not to giggle. Then he brings out a specimen. Well, not a real specimen, but a wax model of a typical restless womb. It looks a bit like a very determined radish. He rotates it dramatically and points to the base. This, he declares, is where temptation anchors. If left uncorrected, it climbs. You are not reassured. Your sex story tonight? A delicate one from the erotic spirit through history. A court lady, anonymous but well documented, claimed she suffered womb storms whenever she read poetry aloud. Her cure was daily exposure to the scent of smoked fish and brief, supervised visits to a herb garden. She later confessed her episodes only worsened during Lent, when the gardens were closed. Historians now suspect she may have been using womb storms as a clever way to avoid choir practice. There's also debate in scholarly circles whether these diagnoses were genuine beliefs or just institutional panic wrapped in flowery Latin. Some say it was all just a misunderstanding of hormones and emotional expression. Others argue it was deliberate, one more method to keep women quiet still and focused on lavender instead of liberty. You look around the room, no one's blinking. Some of the girls look worried. One has stuffed both ears with chamomile just in case. A boy in the corner has fainted, possibly from the goat smell, possibly from existential dread. You're handed a balm. Apply this behind the knees, Brother Alphonse instructs, if you feel the spirit moving. You nod and stuff it in your sleeve. You've got enough balms to start a scented apothecary of your own at this point. Later, walking back to your room, you hear whispers from a pair of novice nuns arguing over whether an itchy elbow could mean the womb has reached the shoulder. You decide not to weigh in. You've already decided that if your womb is floating, it's probably just trying to find a window. You light your candle, crack the window just an inch, and lie back on your mattress, the day's imagery still floating in your mind. A uterus that floats, demons who sniff, goat pens as diagnostic clinics, and somewhere in all of that, girls trying to understand their own bodies through maps made by men who feared lace and poetry. You take a deep breath, the scent of mugwort rising faintly from your collar. You wonder if anyone ever asked the womb what it wanted. Probably just a nap, maybe some fig jam. And as you drift towards sleep, you whisper Psalm 69 backward, not because you believe it works, but because it feels oddly satisfying to defy something, even if it's just air. Tonight, you're invited somewhere different. No hard benches, no chalkboard lectures, no goat-scented cellars. Instead, you're summoned to a private salon tucked behind a tapestry of St. Cecilia looking suspiciously coy. You push the drapery aside and find yourself in a room that smells of cardamom, old books, and slightly forbidden knowledge. The air feels warmer here. Cushions line the floor. A tray of spiced wine glistens beside a silver bowl of candied rose petals. There are no crucifixes in sight. At the center of it all sits a woman named Madame Claire. Nobody knows exactly who appointed her. She seems to answer to no one. Her hands are veiled in lace gloves, her hair pinned into a spiral that defies gravity. She greets you with a voice like folded velvet. Tonight, she says, we read what was never meant to be read aloud. On the table before her lies a stack of parchment, letters. Love letters. But not just any love letters. These were written by none other than Louise de la Vallière, Louis XIV's early and most famously tormented mistress. They were copied and preserved in secret by one of her chambermaids, and somehow Madame Claire has come into possession of them. She offers you one of the letters. The ink is faded, but the writing, elegant, sloping, full of longing, still breathes. My dearest companion, it begins, there is no poetry in a cold bed, nor virtue in silence when desire burns the throat. You blink. You've never seen anything like this in your official instruction manuals. There are no mentions of demons, no punishment wheels, just tenderness, ache, and a sense of something profoundly, painfully human. Madame Claire lifts another letter and begins to read aloud. Louise writes of candlelight, how the shape of the flame can shift the mood of a room, of orange peels dried and crushed between linen sheets to create a scent of warmth without presumption, of silk ribbons tied loosely around the ankles, just tight enough to be noticed when removed. You're not sure whether to blush or applaud. Madame smiles knowingly. They never taught you this in confession, did they? No, they didn't. She passes around more letters. Some are brief, fragments of stolen afternoons, suggestions of whispered promises. Others are long and poetic. One describes the careful positioning of pillows to create an illusion of casual disarray. Another details the benefits of draping a shawl near the hearth so that its scent is warmed before it's worn. You realize what you're learning is not seduction exactly. It's preparation, strategy. A kind of unspoken literacy in the language of sensual power, used not just to allure but to survive. Today's featured sex story, drawn from Sex with Kings, confirms this theme. Louise de la Valliere, while deeply in love with Louis XIV, reportedly agonized over her spiritual guilt. She would sneak out of the royal bedchamber at dawn and gallop on horseback, alone, to a chapel outside the palace walls. There she would kneel until her knees bled, whispering, "Forgive me, but do not unmake what joy has already touched." A priest once advised her to bathe in cold lavender water and read only the epistles. She did, briefly, then returned to court wearing violet satin and quoting Ronsard's poems to the king at dinner. Historians still argue whether Louise was a victim of her era or a masterful manipulator of it. But in her letters you see neither saint nor sinner. You see someone who loved, who doubted, who feared for her soul, and still found time to experiment with scented ink. Your fringe tidbit tonight? In 17th century French court culture, there was a semi-secret language of perfumes. Letters written in lemon essence meant urgency. Rose signified longing, a hint of clove, danger or jealousy, and garlic, not seduction, never that, but a polite warning that the recipient was being watched. Some daring courtiers even pressed herbs between the pages to communicate feelings they couldn't safely write. As the evening continues, Madame Claire invites the group to practice writing their own courtly expressions. You try it, tentatively. A line about candlelight. A note about a lace collar. You spritz the page with a little lavender, just as Louise once did. And then something unexpected. Madame shares a final, unsigned letter. She claims it was found hidden in the lining of a traveling trunk once owned by a lady-in-waiting. The handwriting resembles Louise's, but carries a sharper tone. It reads, "He believes I weep for him. I do not. I weep for myself, for the girl I used to be, who believed that desire must always come wrapped in prayer." No signature, just a smudge of wax and the faint scent of bitter orange. The candles burn lower. The wine is gone. One by one, students slip out, clutching folded letters like relics. You remain, seated near the hearth, watching Madame Claire pack away her treasures. She says nothing, but as you rise to leave, she hands you a folded scrap of parchment. On it is a single line, in her own hand. Never confuse guilt with gravity. Both pull you down, but only one is deserved. You walk back slowly, the note tucked in your sleeve. The halls are quiet. The moonlight catches on your ribbon like silver thread. You undress slowly that night, fold your gown with more care than usual, dab a bit of rose water behind your ears, not for anyone, just for you. A silent nod to the women who came before, who endured, who wrote, who lit the candle just so. And as you lie in bed, the scent of lavender rising from your pillow, you think, maybe the most dangerous kind of education is the one that teaches you how to feel and then asks you to forget. But tonight, you will remember. You're summoned this morning to the village chapel, not for prayer, but for something even more mysterious, a reflection session on the dangers of idle self-observation. Translation? Today, you're learning why peasant boys were told to fear mirrors. You're herded with the others into a narrow corridor off the nave, where 3 battered-looking glasses lean against a wall. Each mirror is shrouded with a cloth embroidered with little crosses and fig leaves. A nun with a surprisingly loud voice for someone named Sister Aimee begins the lecture. She starts with the basics. Vanity is a sin. Pride opens the door to temptation. That's all standard. But then she lowers her voice to a whisper and says, "And if you stare too long, something might stare back." The group shifts uncomfortably. Apparently, in several rural parts of France, particularly in the marshy, half-forgotten corners of Poitou, there was a long-standing belief that a young man who spent too long admiring his own reflection could unleash the fires within. And we're not talking metaphorical fire. They believed mirrors could activate lust. Your eyes, Sister Aimee explains, are the windows through which the devil watches. You watch yourself. She points dramatically at the covered mirrors. He waits in there, patiently, for a sign of pride or curiosity. You try not to smirk. Jacques, as usual, is already sweating. The teaching was clear. A man who looked too closely at his own body, especially alone, especially unclothed, risked inviting unclean thoughts, spontaneous desire, and in some cases, blindness. Yes, real blindness. Today's fringe fact: a medical pamphlet from 1641 warns that prolonged ocular self-contact, especially when paired with bodily reflection, could result in melting of the optic nerves. Some believe this was divine punishment, others that the soul was too delicate to withstand direct confrontation with its own vessel. Either way, mirrors were treated with suspicion. Some boys were even encouraged to fog their bedroom mirrors each night with vinegar steam or cover them with holy cloths. One extreme bishop in the Pyrenees declared that all unmarried boys over the age of 14 should keep a blessed rooster feather pinned to their mirror frame to shame the eyes from wandering. No explanation why a rooster feather, but you suspect the logic was more decorative than divine. Now, your sex story this evening comes courtesy of the erotic spirit through history. There's a tale of a young nobleman in the court of Gaston of Orleans, known for his narcissistic tendencies. He reportedly spent hours adjusting his curls in the mirror, shirt half unbuttoned, perfecting his angle. His valet, concerned, slipped him a note warning of the mirror devil, a creature said to emerge when vanity and lust align. The nobleman scoffed, but later confessed to strange dreams involving candlelight, his own reflection, and a conversation that ended in an embrace. Whether real or imagined, it spooked him enough to cover all his mirrors in lace for the rest of his life. Historians still debate whether these mirror taboos were about genuine fear or simply clever social conditioning. After all, it was easier to prevent youthful experimentation by blaming the glass than by explaining the body. Fear of reflections became a stand-in for fear of the self, and it worked. In some parishes, mirrors were considered a luxury only for married men, because married men, presumably, were already too exhausted to sin. You're ushered into a line and asked to uncover one of the chapel mirrors. Slowly, you lift the cloth. It's ordinary, slightly warped. Your own face stares back, curious, tired, a bit smudged with soot from the chapel candles. You're told to repeat a verse from Proverbs as you look. "Turn my eyes from vanity and give me life in your ways." You whisper it. You wait. Nothing happens. But Jacques, behind you, gasps, "I think mine blinked." You stifle a laugh. The lesson ends with a dramatic recovering of the mirrors and a warning to avoid reflective surfaces, still water, and certain kinds of polished fruit. Apples are apparently especially risky. As you walk back through the cloister garden, you pass a fountain and catch a glimpse of yourself in the water. For a moment you freeze. The reflection is soft, dreamlike. You look older than you feel, a little sad, a little amused. You wonder, how many boys looked into the mirror and weren't afraid of lust or blindness, but of not recognizing what looked back? How many mistook their own longing for something evil, when really it was just curiosity? That night in your chamber, you hesitate before facing the metal plate they call a mirror. You think of all the warnings, the candles, the vinegar cloths, the rooster feathers. And then slowly you tilt the plate towards you. There you are, still you, still breathing, still whole. And you realize, maybe the fear was never the mirror. Maybe the fear was what you might learn if you stared long enough without flinching. You set the mirror aside, not because you're afraid, but because for once, you'd rather close your eyes and imagine a world where no one tells you what to see. You're greeted this evening with incense. Not the gentle, churchy kind that floats through the chapel during Vespers, but a heavier, muskier perfume that clings to your clothes and your conscience. It smells like cloves, boiled wine, and something faintly floral, like wilted roses left in a drawer too long. The scent leads you toward the edge of town, where the streets curve in on themselves and the lamps seem to flicker for effect. You're not alone. You and a handful of other students are led, chaperoned naturally, by Father Remy, who seems deeply uncomfortable. He walks with his hands folded too tightly, as if afraid the air might misinterpret his intentions. Tonight's lesson is different. It takes place in a brothel. Yes, that's not a metaphor. It's a brothel. One the church calls La Maison Blanche, the White House, though most people in town know it by its older nickname, the Lace Trap. You expect scandal, shadows, perhaps the scent of sin itself. But what you find when you step through the door is cleanliness, not pristine, not sterile, but warm, lived in, cared for. There are candles on every surface, bowls of potpourri tucked into corners, the floor is scrubbed, the linens are crisp. The women, when they appear, are not lounging dramatically or painted like opera villains. They're just people, in robes, in slippers, sipping tea, adjusting hairpins. The madam of the house, Margot, greets you with a curtsy so smooth it borders on sarcastic. She's older, sharp-eyed, dressed in layers of faded gold. We heard the church was sending another inspection, she says with a wink. But you lot look far too young to judge anyone. Father Remy clears his throat. Margot leads you into the parlor, a room filled with velvet chairs, faded portraits, and what appears to be a shrine made entirely of half-burnt love letters. She explains, with the tone of someone reciting a well-worn tale, that this establishment was once a convent, then a boarding house, then a place of rest. The church, she adds, sanctioned it during a particularly difficult winter when too many soldiers flooded the city and too few moral arguments could hold them back. That's when the ritual began. Every month, the Maison Blanche undergoes a cleansing, not metaphorical, literal. A priest visits, holy water is sprinkled, psalms are read, garlic and sage are burned. The girls stand in a line, hands clasped, and their names are read aloud, some real, some false, all symbolic. Afterward, each woman is given a white ribbon to tie around her wrist or ankle as a sign of hopeful renewal. Margot doesn't smile as she describes this, but neither does she sneer. This place, she says, was built to house contradiction. And indeed, contradiction is everywhere. There's a crucifix in each bedroom, a small basin of holy water near the stairwell, candles bearing the image of St. Catherine next to jars of scented oil and little velvet boxes labeled Coin pour l'amour. You're told that one of the priests who helped establish the rituals also wrote the house's original menu of services, not with prices but with euphemisms, conversation by firelight, songs of encouragement, storytelling under light pressure. There's even an item simply titled Warm Silence, your fringe tidbit of the night. In 17th century France, certain brothels, including this one, were issued permits signed by church officials that included clauses like discreet acknowledgement of sin and periodic emotional confession. Workers were legally required to rest on Sundays and avoid touching figs during Advent. Figs again. You're introduced to Elise, a retired worker who now manages linens and leads the monthly confession groups. She has silver-threaded hair and hands like folded parchment. Elise tells you plainly, some men come here to sin, some come to weep, some just want to hear someone say their name kindly. She opens a drawer filled with sachets, small cloth pouches tied with ribbon and labeled by mood, regretful, lonely, soothed. Each one smells different, clove, thyme, a hint of lemon or ashes. Elise says they're meant to be slept with under the pillow. They take away the sharp edges, she whispers. You ask how many women live here now. She doesn't answer with a number, just says enough to know each other's ghosts. Tonight's featured sex story is fitting. From Sex with Kings, we learn that one of Louis XIV's most trusted ministers, let's call him Monsieur R., was known to frequent a brothel like this one. Not for what you'd think. He paid for a girl to recite the Psalms to him while he napped. Fully clothed, face down. He'd leave extra coins if she used a Breton accent and mispronounced the names of the apostles. Once, when asked why he did this, he reportedly replied, "Because the silence in church is too loud." As you walk the halls, you notice details. Scarves hung beside windows, books with pressed flowers hidden between pages, a small shelf filled with children's shoes, donated, Elise says, by a seamstress who once lived here and made peace with her own story. Historians still debate whether brothels like this were exploitative or protective, whether they served women or caged them in a different kind of service. The truth, as always, is more complicated. You see no villains here, no saints either, just people surviving, adapting, finding ritual in ruin. As you leave, Margot hands you a folded note sealed with wax. Later, in your room, you open it. There's a single sentence inside. Not all sanctuaries have steeples. You place the note under your pillow, beside a sachet labeled stillness. You think of Elise, of the women, of the priest with the Breton lullabies, of candles and cleansing and the sharpness of clove lingering in the air. And you wonder if salvation, in the end, is less about purity and more about being seen and soothed and held, even just for a night. You can't sleep tonight, not because of anything loud or dramatic. There's no thunderstorm, no animal howling outside your window, no sudden bout of indigestion from the overboiled carrots at dinner. No, tonight's sleeplessness is quieter, slower. It begins with a whisper you overheard in the corridor just before bedtime. "Don't sleep on your back," someone said. "The nightmares come then." You paused at the door, turned your head, raised an eyebrow. "Nightmares?" A second voice, softer, followed. The kind where something touches you and doesn't leave. And that was it. No explanation, no reassurance, just a warning dropped like a stone into your thoughts, sending ripples that haven't stopped since. So here you are now, lying perfectly still in bed, staring at the ceiling beams and trying to remember whether you're actually on your side or just slightly angled back. You shift again nervously, just in case, because you know what lesson is scheduled for tomorrow. They warned you this one would be different. At dawn, the chapel bells toll slower than usual. A single, low note, over and over. You walk with the others to the instruction chamber, barefoot this time, as instructed. To feel the truth of the earth beneath your steps, the priest said. When you arrive, the room is dark, lit only by 3 candles and a hearth fire that seems entirely decorative. There's a strong smell of rosemary and garlic, and a bowl of salt on every table. You're handed a small pouch containing a piece of coal wrapped in linen. "For protection," someone whispers. The day's topic? Night visitations. Or to use the formal phrase written at the top of the lesson parchment, nocturnal assaults of a spiritual nature, specifically incubi and succubi. The church has believed in them for centuries. Spirits, sometimes demons, sometimes souls in purgatory, depending on the theologian, who visit sleepers in the night to tempt, seduce, or torment them. Incubi, said to appear as men, target women. Succubi, their mirror image, tempt men. But gender is a blurry thing in demonology. What matters is desire, not form. You're told that these entities feed not on flesh, but on essence. That undefined something that makes a soul spark. That they slip through windows, hover above you while you sleep, and pour dreams into your mind like honey and ash. The priest reads from a dusty manual. He does not look thrilled. Signs of visitation may include sudden warmth in the chest, dreams of physical closeness, unexplained pressure on the body, prolonged waking with thoughts unbefitting the devout. He pauses, adjusts his spectacles, and mutters, "Or unfortunate stains upon the sheets." You cough quietly into your sleeve. What follows is a demonstration, not of the visitations, thankfully, but of the precautions. You're shown how to burn rosemary at the foot of the bed, how to wash the soles of your feet with salted vinegar, how to lay out your nightshirt so that the sleeves cross over your chest like folded wings. These rituals, you're told, confuse the shadows. Tonight's fringe detail? In some parts of 17th century France, people believed that these night spirits could be deterred by placing an open pair of embroidery scissors under the bed, blades pointing north. In the village of Saugas, unmarried women were told to sleep with a mirror beneath their pillow, but only if it was wrapped in a red cloth. The red absorbed the spirit's energy, apparently. The mirror caught its shape. The boy next to you raises his hand. What if the dream feels good? There's a pause. The priest replies carefully, "The flesh does not always know what the soul refuses. That is why confession exists." Your sex story tonight is a peculiar one, from the erotic spirit through history. A noblewoman in Tours wrote in her diary that for 7 nights in a row she dreamed of a stranger in a green cloak who kissed her neck, whispered riddles, and vanished just before sunrise. She began sleeping in the stables to avoid him. Eventually, Her confessor advised she change bedrooms, burn dried apple peel at dusk, and wear her stockings inside out. It worked, or at least the dream stopped. Historians still argue whether these visitations were misunderstood sleep paralysis, suppressed desire, or deliberate metaphors used to avoid shame. Some say they were coping mechanisms, especially for women forbidden from speaking openly about longing or discomfort. Others believe these stories reflected real spiritual anxieties that made the invisible tangible. You return to your room that evening with your pouch of linen-wrapped coal, your salt bowl, and a half-spent sprig of rosemary. You follow every step, wash your feet, cross your sleeves, whisper Psalm 3 into your pillow. You even check the corners of the room for gaps in the stone. You don't believe in demons, probably, but you do believe in loneliness, and you believe in dreams that feel more real than morning. As you lie in bed, you recall something your friend Elise once said during evening chores. The mind is clever. It wraps what it wants in symbols, like ribbon on a knife. You close your eyes. You dream. In your dream, someone sits at the foot of your bed. They say nothing. They don't move. They smell like cold stone and time. You wake up. Nothing is there. But the rosemary is gone. You pull the blanket tighter, not because you're afraid, but because, for the first time, you understand that some fears are not about belief. They're about having too many questions, and no one who will answer them without lighting a candle and calling it a sin. The air smells of burnt sage and nerves. It's early morning, but no one is pretending this is an ordinary day. The usual sounds, bells, chores, footsteps in the hallway, are muffled beneath a hush that's more felt than heard. Even the birds outside the cloister garden seem quieter. You don't need to ask what's happening. You've already heard it whispered during breakfast. They've put her on trial. You follow the others through winding cobbled lanes into the village center. No one is speaking. There's no ceremony, no music, just tension, a strange, charged stillness that reminds you more of a funeral than a court proceeding. Except today, it's both. You're ushered into the assembly hall, wooden beams overhead, cold stone underfoot, candles flickering nervously in the draught. There's a platform at the front where normally a wedding would be blessed or a tax dispute aired. Today, a single chair waits under a banner marked Inquisitio. She is already seated. Her name is Marguerite, a widow, a baker's wife once, before her husband died and her reputation started to take on the shape of smoke, formless but clinging. You've seen her in the market before, tall, neat, quiet-eyed, the sort of woman who seems to know your secrets before you do. They say she had 3 lovers in 5 years. All died strangely, one in his sleep. One fell from a ladder, one simply disappeared. She never cried. That was her first mistake. The second? Keeping herbs under her bed. Lavender, mugwort, something that smelled faintly of citrus. The third, owning a goat. White, well-fed, and according to a neighbor, too affectionate. And the fourth, when questioned by the parish clerk, she looked him in the eye and said, "Desire is not a crime." The trial begins. A priest takes the floor. He reads from parchment, listing her offenses in the slow, theatrical cadence of someone who knows the crowd needs to be won over. The language is careful. Disorderly affections, unapproved herbal practice, unorthodox behaviors of the body and spirit. You're handed a lesson scroll. Today's topic in florid script, the body as a gateway to temptation and witchcraft. It's not subtle. Marguerite is asked if she practiced spells. "I mix tea," she says. "With what purpose? To sleep better, to soften my knees, to forget." Forget what? His voice. There's a silence in the hall. She is asked if she seduced men. "I welcomed them," she says, "and I asked them nothing but to be kind." That answer alone causes murmurs. You sense it, how the crowd leans away from her honesty, afraid it might stick to their clothes. Today's fringe detail? In 17th century France, women accused of witchcraft were often charged not with casting spells, but with influencing emotions. Crying at odd times, laughing alone, touching someone's arm too long at a harvest dance, owning a mirror with no husband to justify it. There were pamphlets circulated warning of body sorcery, the idea that a woman's posture, voice, or smell could alter a man's judgment. It sounds ridiculous now, but you can feel it, how that fear shaped the world. One piece of evidence presented today is a red ribbon found in Marguerite's drawer, scented with something floral. When asked what the scent was, she replies, "Just thyme and orange peel. I like to sleep near sweetness. The priest frowns as though sweetness itself were a threat. You're told later that some bishops believed women like her carried natural magnetism, ferula sensus, a force that disrupted masculine clarity. No one really knew what it meant, but it made things easier to explain. If a man sinned, it was because she pulled him there. Your sex story tonight is one of layered tragedy, drawn from Sex with Kings. Lavoisin, the infamous Parisian sorceress of Louis XIV's time, offered services no court physician would dare. Herbal abortions, love spells, secret trysts arranged through coded messages. She knew everything about everyone. She was executed, of course, burned alive. But not before half the women of the court had visited her and left lighter, freer, or just momentarily less afraid. Historians still argue whether women like Lavoisin and Marguerite were dangerous or merely inconvenient. To live as a woman with knowledge, confidence, and the ability to inspire desire was already enough to be marked. Back at the trial, someone reads aloud a love letter found in Marguerite's home. It's unsigned, possibly never sent. It reads, "I dreamed of your hands in flower, your mouth in silence. I will come when the moon turns." The hall is silent. "Did you write that?" she's asked. She doesn't answer. They ask if she regrets anything. "I regret nothing but that the bread burned on the day he left," she replies, so softly you almost don't hear it. No verdict is announced today. The priest declares a delay for further prayer. But everyone knows the outcome. You've seen it before. She'll be fined, banished, or worse. As you walk back to your chamber, your teacher tries to frame the day's events as a warning. "Let this be a lesson," he says, "that indulgence of the senses leads to ruin." But your mind is full of Marguerite's voice. The way she sat with her back straight, her words unbent, the smell of orange peel, the laugh she never gave them. Later that night, in your room, you write something down. Not a confession, not a sin, just a truth. Sometimes sweetness is the bravest thing you can allow yourself. You hide the note inside your pillowcase, next to a sprig of thyme, and as you drift off to sleep, you dream of red ribbons and warm bread, and a woman who dared to sleep with sweetness beneath her bed. The bells ring differently today. Not the sharp clinks of morning mass, not the long solemn tolls reserved for funerals. No, these are deep, layered chimes, slightly uneven, slightly too slow, meant to stir something other than piety. As you sit up in bed, half wrapped in your blanket, you already know. Today is the day of shadows. It only happens once a season. You've heard whispers, seen preparations, but now it's real. Outside, the sky is unusually gray for mid-morning, as if someone threw a veil over the sun. You dress quietly, without instruction. Everyone does. No one needs to be told where to go. There's a current in the air, heavy humming, and it pulls you down the cloistered corridors, out past the herb garden, and into the square. There, draped in black velvet and dried flowers, stands the object of the day's focus, the catafalque. It's not a coffin exactly, but it isn't not a coffin either. A hollow box, large enough for a body, mounted on 4 wheels and flanked by poles for lifting. Its sides are carved with angels, flames, and roses, some whole, some wilted. The priest, Father Darius, stands beside it in a white robe with crimson trim. He holds a scroll in one hand and a sprig of rosemary in the other. Around him, novices and elders alike form a slow-spreading circle. Today's lesson, as printed on your parchment, is brief. How bodies become symbols. No one blinks. Father Darius begins speaking. He tells you the story of Saint Aurelia, patroness of chastity, silence, and second chances. According to the record, or legend depending on who's asked, Aurelia died in the arms of a would-be lover she refused. His grief, or perhaps his rage, led to her death. But a week later, her body was found uncorrupted. Her eyes were open, her mouth smiling. Miracle or myth, the church claimed her soul had been retempered, that she had risen spiritually without the burden of resurrection. And so they began the procession. Each season, her symbolic body is paraded through the town, not to honor her death, but to remind others that some forms of desire lead to sanctity, and others to silence. As the procession begins, 4 novices lift the catafalque. You're told it's lighter than it looks, but heavy enough to remember. The crowd moves slowly behind it, through the stone arches, past the bakery, the tannery, and the little fountain where children usually play. Not today. You pass doorways lined with laurel, windows covered with gauze, Some villagers cross themselves, others look away. Everyone seems to understand. You don't follow St. Aurelia to celebrate her. You follow her to learn from her mistake. Your fringe tidbit today? In rural parts of 17th century France, unmarried women were sometimes required to participate in living funerals, symbolic ceremonies where they were dressed in veils and white shrouds, led through the village, and mourned for their lost purity. Some historians argue these rituals were communal purification acts. Others believe they were structured humiliations, wrapped in the pretense of penance. The catafalque stops at 3 points. First, the old granary, where Father Darius sprinkles salt and says, "For the hunger that is not of the belly." Second, the apothecary, where he burns cloves and garlic over coals, saying, "For the remedies that cure and curse alike." Third, the steps of the chapel, where a bowl of milk and honey is poured into the dirt, for sweetness lost and sweetness taken. The final stop is the ossuary. You've never been inside before. It's colder than expected. Rows of bones line the walls, arranged carefully, reverently. Not a crypt of terror, but of memory. You're invited in, one by one, to lay a sprig of thyme upon a ledge carved with the words, "What the flesh forgets, the soul must carry." And then silence. You look at the catafalque one last time. It seems smaller now, less like a container, more like a mirror. Your sex story today isn't about Aurelia, it's about what came after. In the history of sexuality, Foucault recounts the case of a nun who was venerated for surviving temptation. She was found in her cell, surrounded by torn pages of erotic poetry and weeping beside a candle. Her diary revealed nothing scandalous, only this line, "I did not touch, but I burned. Is the smoke not sin?" She was praised, canonized even, but her confessor was later censured for leaving the poetry in her chamber in the first place. Historians still debate, was she resisting or rehearsing? Back at the cloister, you sit by the fountain. The children are still gone. The petals they would have scattered now drift in the breeze, settling in gutters and corners. You think of St. Aurelia, of her refusal, her smile, her second death, of the women who walked behind their own symbols, clothed in mourning for sins they never got to commit. You press your hand to your chest, just above the ribs. Your heart beats steady, loud, unapologetic. Later that night, you write her name on a scrap of paper and burn it over a candle. You whisper, "You deserved more than silence." The smoke curls toward the ceiling, fragrant with time. You sleep soundly for once. You wake to silence. Not just any silence, the heavy kind. The kind that feels alive. The kind that sits at the edge of your bed, watching. You know this isn't ordinary. It isn't dawn quiet. It's too still, too deliberate. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a thick woolen cloak. There's no bell ringing, no scraping of wooden stools from the dining hall, no familiar steps echoing in the stone corridors. Even the birds seem to have decided today is not a day for singing. You sit up in bed, blankets still tangled around your ankles. Something's off. You call out softly, just a simple hello, but your voice doesn't travel. It feels swallowed by the air, like sound itself has been forbidden from continuing. You dress quickly. The chill in the air bites through your linen robe, and your fingers fumble at the clasps. You push open your chamber door. The hallway is empty. Usually, someone would be sweeping, or muttering a prayer, or dropping something fragile. Today, nothing. You walk quietly toward the main corridor. Still no one. No flickering candlelight, no incense, no faint drone of chanting from the chapel. Just echoes of your own breath and the soft scuff of your slippers on cold stone. You head for the refectory, empty. Plates still stacked. Bread left on the counter, half sliced. A pot of porridge cooling as if someone had just stepped away mid-task. You touch the side of the pot. Still warm. You try the garden next. The rosemary and thyme look freshly watered. A rake rests on the soil. A basket sits half filled with mint leaves. No wind, no bees, no footsteps on the gravel. The monastery is not abandoned. It's paused. You step outside the gates, heart beginning to race. Down the hill lies the village, always bustling at this hour. Chickens clucking, carts creaking, market stalls creaking open. Today, nothing. Shutters are drawn, doors ajar. A scarf flutters from a windowsill. A hat rests on a barrel. There's a pipe still smoldering on the bench near the well, smoke curling into the still air. Where is everyone? You're not scared yet, but your body is starting to feel like maybe you should be. Your breath is short. Your chest feels like it's bracing for an explanation that never comes. You return to the cloister. You wander room after room, the library, books open, parchment mid-sentence, the scriptorium, quills left in ink pots, wax dripping beside untouched letters. You could almost believe they'd all been raptured mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-life. You reach your chamber again, unsure why you came back. But when you step inside, something has changed. There's parchment on your desk. It wasn't there before. It's small, folded neatly once, sealed with a sprig of lavender tied in red thread. You open it with hands that feel both clumsy and too careful. The note reads, "When the world falls silent, it is time to listen to yourself." You sit, not because you're tired, but because the message hits you harder than it should. It feels personal, not general. Like whoever left it knows what you've been avoiding. You stay seated for a long while, and in that stillness, something strange happens. The quiet becomes different, not the eerie emptiness from before, but something richer, layered. You start to hear the smaller sounds, your breath, the tiny creak of your chair, the wind outside whispering against the shutter, the occasional pop of cooling wood, the distant echo of water moving underground. You begin to wonder, has it always been this loud underneath the silence? You look around your room, not for people, but for meaning. You notice how the light hits the floor differently today. You notice the stitching on your pillowcase, the way the lavender sprig from the note now scents the whole desk. Maybe this isn't a punishment or a curse or a trial. Maybe this is a gift, your fringe tidbit of the day. In certain French Benedictine circles during the 17th century, once a year, the entire abbey would observe what was known as the Day of Severance, a full 24 hours in which no speech, no reading, and no liturgy were allowed. Not even humming. The idea was to allow the monks to hear the inner bell, the voice of their soul ringing without interruption. Some records describe visions, dreamlike clarity, even spontaneous laughter. One monk simply wrote, "I heard my childhood again." You wonder if that's what's happening now. You remember a moment from months ago, a night when you couldn't sleep, and you whispered a quiet wish, "I just want a day without noise." And now here it is. Today's story, drawn from the history of sexuality, describes a solitary mystic who lived for years in enforced silence after claiming to have heard the divine body breathing beneath the world. She was visited by pilgrims, but she never spoke to them. She only handed them small notes. One said, "The sound you fear is your own longing." You look again at the note left for you. Maybe this is what longing looks like. Maybe stillness is where you meet it. You rise, you take your journal. You begin to write, not about the silence, but within it. You write about what your body remembers, the things that usually hide under conversation and ritual. You write, "I am here. I am listening. I am not afraid." And it's true. For the first time in a long while, it's true. The silence is no longer lonely. It's become instructional. It teaches you how to listen, not to others, but to the invisible mechanisms behind your own thoughts, to the rhythms of your breath, to the places your feet want to go before your mind catches up. You start to notice how stillness has texture, layers, even flavors. Today, the stillness tastes like fennel. You don't know why, but that's the kind of thing you just accept now. You find yourself wandering toward a place you rarely visit, the old East Corridor. It smells like damp wool and dried ink, and the floor creaks in places no one bothers to repair. Most novices ignore it. The elders call it the quiet wing, but no one seems to use it for anything beyond storage. You push open the warped oak door at the end and discover a narrow staircase you've never noticed before. It leads down, not up. Not to a tower or lookout or prayer room, but into the belly of the monastery. You descend. At the bottom is a small room, round like a well. It's made entirely of stone. No windows, no candles lit, just one lantern on the wall, flickering softly like it's been waiting for you. In the middle of the room, a chair, and beside it a basin. You move closer. The chair is unremarkable, wooden, with a slight curve in the back, worn smooth where hands have gripped it again and again. The basin, however, is full. Water still as glass, infused with something herbal. Rosemary? Lavender? No. Garlic. Your pulse ticks up. There's a piece of folded parchment on the seat. You hesitate, then pick it up. When the body has been silenced, the spirit speaks. You sit. Not because you've been instructed, but because what else would you do? You stare at the water. It reflects your face in an unsettlingly clear way, like it sees past the surface. You suddenly remember something you were told in your first week here, that mirrors were discouraged for the young. They invite vanity, said your instructor, or worse, recognition. You lean in, and for a second your reflection doesn't move with you. You blink. It's fine. It was just a flicker. Still, something is happening here. Something layered, old. Your fringe tidbit for today? In some parts of 17th century France, particularly rural convents, secret reflection rooms were maintained for nuns nearing the end of their silent vows. These rooms weren't for prayer or study. They were designed for sensory restoration. They often contained scented water, handwritten meditations, and symbolic objects, ribbons, shells, or dried fruit. Some scholars argue these rooms were a kind of meditative sex education, spaces where repressed intimacy was redirected toward internal awareness. Others claim they were surveillance tools in disguise. Historians still argue whether these rooms empowered or disarmed their users. You reach into the basin. The water is cool, but not cold. It feels thick somehow, like it's holding something beyond temperature. You let your fingers trail through it, and memories begin to surface. Not dramatic ones, just moments. A hand brushing yours in the herb garden. The way someone once looked at you over candlelight. The strange warmth you felt when you were handed a folded napkin at dinner and your fingers lingered a moment too long on theirs. None of these things ever mattered. And yet, here they are. You begin to speak. Quietly. Just one word, stay. You're not sure who you're saying it to. The silence answers back, gently. Not with sound, but with weight, with presence. You look up. Another door you hadn't noticed before now stands open. You step through it. This room is warmer, smaller. There's a bench, a window covered in muslin, and shelves full of things that look half like sacred tools and half like childhood toys. Dried fruit slices strung on thread, wooden carvings of doves and foxes, a velvet pouch of cloves, a painted fan, and more letters. They're stored in a chest at the foot of the bench. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all folded in different ways. Some sealed with wax, others tied with hair, thread, dried petals. You open one. To the girl I watched braid garlic into her belt, I still dream of your hands. You open another. I kept your glove. I tell the saints it was an accident. Another. We were never sinful, just unspoken. You stop reading. It's too much. But it's beautiful, not in the romantic sense, but in the human sense. This was how they did it, how they survived. When they weren't allowed to name desire, they wrote around it, bent it into ribbon and clove and scraps of linen. They didn't need permission. They just needed somewhere to put it. You light a small candle left on the bench. It sputters to life and fills the room with the smell of tallow and dried rose. You sit and write. Not a confession, not a prayer, just truth. I watched her laugh into her sleeve, and I remembered my own skin. You fold the note, place it in the box, and as you leave the room, you do not look back. The basin has stilled, the garlic scent is gone, and the silence, it feels earned now. By now, the silence no longer surprises you. It doesn't jar you or pull your attention like a thread across the day. It's not a ghostly absence anymore, not a vanishing act. It's a presence, almost a roommate. It waits patiently at your shoulder when you chop herbs, keeps you company as you fold your blanket, walks just half a step behind you down the cloister hall. This morning, you wake before the sun. The moonlight through your window is clear and silver, and it outlines everything in your room with delicate precision. Your sandals, the stool, the garlic braid you left last night on the edge of your writing desk. You touch the braid. Someone, something has added time to it. You smile, though no one sees it. You move through the monastery like a phantom. The halls are unchanged. You step into the refectory. The bread someone half-sliced 4 days ago is now crusted over, hard as stone. No new hand has prepared breakfast. And yet the copper pot still gleams, polished. You walk to the southern garden. Not the main herb plot, but the one fenced off behind the old dovecote. The one you always thought was ornamental, until now. Inside the garden, a surprise. There are footprints in the dirt, not yours. Barefoot, small, pressed lightly in the soft soil. They circle the rosemary, weave past the rue, and pause at a ring of lavender that's bloomed since yesterday. Someone else has been here. You kneel by the time bed and find it. Another folded letter. This one's wrapped in red cloth and tucked under a flat stone. You read, "I've been listening too. In silence, I found you." It's not signed. You press the note to your chest just for a moment. Then you return it, tucking it back where you found it. You don't need to know who wrote it. The message is enough. Today's historical moment, drawn from Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, where he describes how, in times of intense repression, communication didn't vanish. It went underground. Meaning became encoded in gestures, colors, herbs. The gift of a garlic bulb, especially in 17th century France, wasn't just culinary. It signaled protection, desire, even loyalty and secret romances between servants, courtiers, or those taking religious vows. The church forbade open desire, but human bodies, they whispered anyway. And now, so do you. You kneel beside the lavender and leave something in return. A small thread from your robe, tied into a knot. It's not much, but it's what you have. A token, a message. You walk the long way back through the chapel, passing under the high stained glass windows that spill a slow river of morning light across the pews. You pause. There, on your usual bench, is a new object, a notebook, handmade, bound in soft leather with a sprig of sage tucked beneath the cord. No name, no mark. You open it. Inside, blank pages, except the first one. It reads in looping ink, "This space is for the ones who stayed. Say what you couldn't say aloud." You hesitate. Then sit. You press your hand to the page, feeling the texture of it. Then slowly, you begin to write. "I feared silence would consume me. Instead, it held me, fed me, rewrote me." You stop, then keep going. "There were nights I wanted noise, but now I crave the quiet breath of lavender leaves brushing my ankles. I used to whisper my name in the dark to remember it. Now I whisper yours." You don't know who you're writing to, but you know they'll read it. You close the notebook, return it to the pew, and leave it behind, just like everyone else's letters. A chain of quiet confessions passing from hand to hand. Later, you make your way to the old bell tower, not to ring it, just to climb it. The steps are narrow, the wood soft with age. You pause halfway to catch your breath, to press your fingers to the wall and feel the tremble of the wind through the stones. At the top, a view. The village is still. The trees sway gently. Clouds drift like thick cream across the sky. You feel the hush of the world beneath you, and you understand something new. The silence isn't passive. It's listening. To you, to the garlic you buried, to the ribbon you tied, to the lines you wrote quietly with no audience but yourself. It listens, and maybe, just maybe, it speaks back. In rosemary, in old notebooks, in the echoing steps of another soul you haven't yet seen, but who walks the same halls at the same pace. You take one last look over the valley, then descend the steps slowly, deliberately, as if returning from something sacred, because maybe you are. You awaken to a subtle change in the air. It's the softest twist of routine, the slightest difference that whispers something is ending. The silence feels softer now, as if it knows the journey is drawing to a close. Your room is the same, but not the same. The braid of garlic and thyme still lies where you placed it, unchanged, unmoved. You press it under your pillow, letting its scent mingle with your dreams. You rise quietly, aware of every shift in the floorboards beneath your feet. Today is the last day in this strange, suspended world. Tomorrow the bells will toll again. Voices will return. The monastery will breathe, and you with it. But today is for completion. The kitchen offers stale bread and cool spring water. No clatter of utensils, no voices, yet the stillness is familiar, comforting even. You accept it like a friend you've known long enough to trust. You take your loaf outside to the cloister garden. The morning breeze stirs the lavender blooms, and bees hum with purpose. You head to the small circle where the thyme and mint were arranged yesterday. The red thread knot you placed there lies still, glinting softly in sunlight. You kneel to the soil, press your hands into the earth around it. Then you weave a fresh stem of rosemary through the knot, as if tying a final loop in a ribboned memory. Nearby, you notice a small leather-bound notebook sitting on a stone bench, front cover worn but supple. You pick it up, your heart tightens. It must be yours. The breath of sage still clings to the cover. You open it to the last page. It reads, "Thank you for speaking. Now feel heard." No signature, no date. It's the same notebook where you wrote your lines yesterday. Someone added those words overnight. Someone you don't know, but whose presence is as real as the manuscript in your hands. You close the notebook gently. The page feels like a pressed leaf, velvety, quiet, sustained. You carry it with you as you walk back toward the old chapel. You feel the eyes of the monastery on you. Soft eyes, not judging, but acknowledging. Inside the chapel, everything is ready for a closing ceremony. Candles stand in their holders, logs are stacked neatly in the hearth, and a single open book lies on the lectern, not scripture, but a blank codex, a space for final words. You approach it and set your notebook beside it, closing your eyes. A thought emerges. Brief, bright, clear. This silence was not empty, it was a home. You pick up a quill and write in the blank book. I came here thinking I would lose myself in quiet. Instead, I found fragments I didn't know were missing, names I forgot I carried, a voice that needed stillness to bloom. I leave my silence behind because I will always carry it within. You sign your name, but not in full, just the initial of the braid you left for those who remain to understand. A breeze whispers through the chapel, no candle flickers except your own breath. You sense presence, not many, but enough. Then, step by step, you walk toward the door. You don't turn back. At the threshold, you pause, hands on the wooden frame. You inhale deeply. The scent of rosemary, sage, garlic, and old pages fills your lungs. You step outside. The courtyard awaits you. You feel the stones beneath your sandals. You feel the sun warm your cheeks. You feel alive. You realize the silence isn't gone. It lives inside you now. It is the steady backdrop to your next story. You walk through the cloister archways one final time, the red ribbon of memory trailing behind, a soft promise that this stillness, this whispered communion continues beyond walls. You climb the path to the gate. The village lies just beyond. You take one last look at the monastic spire. It seems to lean towards you, offering a quiet blessing. You step through. Now, dear listener, take a moment. Let your breath settle. Notice the soft beat of your chest. Let go of any tension that still lingers, the one in your shoulders, the one behind your eyes. In the quiet of your room, imagine you are standing in that courtyard again, with the scent of rosemary and old books all around. You've walked these silent corridors beside me. You've whispered names into a stillness that heard them. You carried garlic braided with time, laid knots of memory in the soil, and spoke truths into notebooks beneath candlelight. You've honored your own voice, soft and steadfast. Now, as you prepare to drift into sleep, let the silence carry you gently. Feel its embrace, not as emptiness, but as sanctuary. Let its presence blanket you, softening the edges of day and easing you toward rest. The world beyond these walls may be noisy. Tomorrow voices, bells, tasks will return. But you already own something quieter, deeper, the space inside your own stillness. It belongs to you always. No one can take it. No whisper can disturb it. No time can erase it. So dim the lights further. Allow your breath to slow. Feel the weight of the day settle. And may your dreams be filled with lavender shadows, softly spoken words, and the gentle whisper of your own heart. Sweet dreams. And thank you for walking through this silence with me.